Buonasera, buonasera, benvenuti a questo incontro conclusivo di Biennale Tecnologia 2024.
Technologia 2024. Welcome to you all. My name is Jose Martin. I am a curator with Luca De Biasi of Biennale Tecnologia. Thank you very much for being here tonight for this final event in our Aula Magna. These have been very intense days. We started on Wednesday evening with a party, one of the novelties of this edition 2024, with a few thousand people here in our classrooms, and then on Tuesday, Friday, Saturday, and here we are today at the conclusion of our Biennale. These have been days filled with interesting events, with ideas, young people, proposal, many young people who participated and asked questions, because ever since our first edition in 2019, we always wanted to involve the audience and make sure that all events, lectures, discussions had a final interaction with the audience. And today is going to be exactly the same. My task today is to introduce our speaker tonight, who will close this Biennale. We're very happy to host him again here in Turin. I say again because he has a connection with Turin. He was in Turin in the past. I met him about 20 years ago for a meeting called Liberamente, when we talked about Creative Commons, free software, and many other things. That was the very first time when I met Cory Doctorow, who really amazed him because of his speed when he speaks in English. And since then, we've kept our contact. I know he's a very good friend of Bruce Sterling and Jasmina, and so we're very, very happy that he's come all the way from Los Angeles to come back here to Turin. Who is Cory Doctorow? Well, he is famous all around the world. He's a sci-fi author, and by the way, he's published many books with a Creative Commons license, if not all of them. He is an activist in the so-called Electronic Frontier Foundation. In other words, he is part of an association of civil society that fights to defend and preserve our digital rights. They've been very successful in many endeavors to preserve online space and make sure that it is reasonably healthy. But he will tell us more. He's also a journalist. He writes a lot. He's written many papers and articles. If you want to be kept up to date on digital issues, he's one of the most authoritative and reliable sources. He has a daily blog, pluralistic.net. I follow it to be updated, and sometimes I find it hard to read what he writes because he's so productive. He also has many academic affiliations. So he writes novels, as I said. He's a sci-fi author. His latest novel is The Last Cause, and his latest essay dwells on a topic that is very close to what we are going to talk about today: how to seize the means of computation. Recently, Cory Doctorow, who is very well known, is very famous in many realms, in IT engineering, for sure. His fame has grown even more in recent weeks because of an article published by the Financial Times that is directly connected to the title of this lecture. So his ideas and positions have become even more widespread and renowned. His analysis of the online world. The article has been translated in Italy as well. So let's say that we're even more motivated to let everybody know how Cory Doctorow is a reference for someone who believes in a digital revolution that is at the service of all of us, of the collectivity, of the community, and not just of a few concentrated interests. Without further ado, I am very happy to invite him up here to the podium. Cory Doctorow.
And thank you especially to my translator, and my apologies. My strategy for dealing with jet lag is to drink enough coffee to kill a rhinoceros, and combine that with the fact that I am one of nature's fast talkers, and I am the scourge of translators everywhere. I will try to keep it slow, and I thank you and apologize in advance for your excellent interpretation back there. So last year I coined this term, enshittification, as a way of describing how platforms decay. And my obscene little word did big numbers. The American Dialect Society made it their word of the year for 2023. It really hit the zeitgeist. I have resigned myself to the fact that this means that I'm going to have a poop emoji on my headstone. So, what is enshittification and why did it strike such a nerve? Enshittification is my theory to explain how the internet came to be colonized by platforms and why all those platforms are degrading so suddenly and so quickly and so thoroughly, and why that matters, and most importantly, what we can do about it. Because we are all living through the Merdocene, a great enshittening in which the services that matter to us, that we rely on, are all turning into giant piles of shit, which is very frustrating. It's demoralizing. Depending on what those platforms mean to you, it can be terrifying. And I think that my enshittification framework goes a long way to explaining it. That it moves us out of a kind of mysterious realm in which the great forces of history are making these platforms go bad, and into a material realm in which specific decisions made by named individuals led us up to that moment. Because after all, those are decisions that we can reverse, and those are named individuals whose home addresses we can learn, and we can also estimate with a great deal of accuracy what size pitchfork they take. So let's break down the enshittification plague. I'm going to talk about its symptoms. What do we see around us when enshittification is upon us? I'm going to talk about the underlying mechanism. What's happening within a platform when it becomes enshittified? I'm going to talk about its epidemiology. Why is everything becoming enshittified right now? And then I'm going to talk about the treatment. So we'll start with the symptoms, what a doctor would call the natural history of enshittification. When a company contracts enshittification, it undergoes a 3-stage process of degradation. In the first stage, it's good to its users. Then, as those users become locked in, it abuses those users to make life better for its business customers. And as those business customers become locked in, it withdraws all the value from both users and business customers, leaving behind just enough residue that we all stay locked to it, and gives all of that value to its shareholders, and then it turns into a giant pile of shit. So let's do a case study, and the best case study for this is, of course, Facebook. Facebook, after all, was always destined to be enshittified. It's a company that was founded so that Mark Zuckerberg and his creepy friends could non-consensually rate the fuckability of their fellow Harvard undergraduates, and it only got worse after that. So when Facebook started off, you had to be an American university student to use it. You needed an email address that ended in .edu. But in 2006, Facebook opened up to the general public, and it made a simple pitch to them. It said, yes, I know you all use MySpace, and MySpace is where your friends are, but has it occurred to you that MySpace is owned by an evil, crapulent, senescent Australian billionaire named Rupert Murdoch, who spies on you with every hour that God sends? We have a very simple value proposition for you over here at Facebook. Come to Facebook, and we will never, ever spy on you. All you need to do is tell us who on the platform matters to you. Follow those people, articulate your social graph, and we will take everything that they post for their followers to see and show it to you. So that was stage one. Facebook had this surplus. It had cash from its investors, and it allocated that surplus to those end users. And those end users, they locked themselves into Facebook. So Facebook, like most tech businesses, it has this thing that economists call network effects on its side. A product has network effects if it gets better when more people use it. So you joined Facebook because there were people there you wanted to talk to. And then once you joined Facebook, other people joined because they wanted to talk to you. And every user who joined Facebook made it more attractive. But Facebook doesn't just have network effects on its side. It also enjoyed another thing that economists talk about, though I think not enough, which is high switching costs. Switching costs are everything that you have to give up if you leave a product or service, if you quit Facebook. Quitting Facebook meant leaving behind all the friends there that weren't ready to quit with you. Now, in theory, you and all your friends could have all left and gone somewhere else. But in practice, it's really hard to get a lot of people to do the same thing at the same time. Economists call this the collective action problem. So maybe you're in a group chat with 6 friends. You can barely agree where to go for a drink on Friday night after work. When there's 200 of you on Facebook, and some of you are there because you have the same rare disease, and some of you are there because that's how the parents of your child's football team organize the carpool, and some of you are there because that's where your customers are, and some of you are there because you left your home country and it's how you stay in touch with your friends. It's almost impossible to get everyone to go. So Facebook's users took each other hostage, and that kept them glued to the platform. And Facebook exploited that hostage situation to withdraw some of the surplus from those end users and give it to their business customers. So to advertisers, Facebook said, do you remember when we told these fools that we weren't going to spy on them? That was a lie. We spy on them from asshole to appetite, and all we require of you is that you give us a very small amount of money, and we will target ads with incredible precision to exactly the users you want to reach. And because we're such wonderful and generous people, we have an entire building full of engineers who will do nothing but fight ad fraud. So if you give us $1 to show an ad to a specific user, that user is going to see those ads. And then Facebook went to the publishers. And they said, hey, do you remember when we told these idiots that we were only going to show them the things they asked to see? That was a lie too. All we ask of you is that you take a little bit of text from your own website where you have a way of making money, and you put that text on Facebook as an excerpt, and you add a link to your own website. And then we are going to take that text and non-consensually cram it into the eyeballs of people who never asked to see it. Some of those people will click that link and you can make money off of them. It's a free traffic funnel because we're so generous. So the advertisers and the publishers became dependent on Facebook's users who were locked in because of each other. And now everyone was hostage. And Facebook withdrew the surplus from everyone, not just from end users whose feeds dwindled to a homeopathic residue of things that they asked to see, creating a void that could be filled with things that people would pay to show them, but also for advertisers who found that the fidelity and reliability of ad targeting went down, even as the price of advertising went up. And for publishers, they found that it was no longer sufficient to put a short excerpt on Facebook to get it recommended or even shown to their subscribers. The excerpt had to get longer and longer and longer, more and more substitutive of a visit to their own webpage, until they became a commodity supplier to Facebook. And then Facebook said, by the way, that link to your website, maybe it's a malicious link. So we're not going to show your subscribers anything that has a link to something off Facebook. So now you're fully commodified, publishing the whole article with no link back to your site. And the only way to make money is with that corrupt advertising market. And so those groups, they weren't happy about it. They complained. But Facebook graduated from the most important business school in America, the Darth Vader MBA. And if you graduate with a Darth Vader MBA, you know what to say when someone complains to you. You say, I have altered the deal. Pray I don't alter it further. Now Facebook is in the most dangerous phase of enshittification. It wants to withdraw all available surplus, leave just enough behind to keep everyone stuck to the platform, but make sure that every extractable cent is returned to its shareholders. And the problem for Facebook is that is a very brittle equilibrium, because the difference between I hate Facebook, but I can't stop logging in, and I hate Facebook, and I'm never logging in again, is razor thin. All it takes is one privacy scandal, one whistleblower, one live-streamed mass shooting, and people bolt for the exits. And then Facebook discovers a hard lesson about network effects, which is that if everyone is staying because the people that matter to them are there, then when the people that matter to them leave, there's no reason not to leave as well. And when that happens, Facebook panics. Now in Silicon Valley, they don't call it panicking, they call it pivoting. Facebook's pivot looked like this. Mark Zuckerberg told us, I promised you that the future was that you would spend the rest of eternity arguing with your racist uncle using my primitive text interface. But I've had a revelation, and the future will consist of me transforming you and everyone you love into a legless, sexless, heavily surveilled, low-polygon cartoon character in a virtual world called the metaverse that we stole from a 25-year-old satirical cyberpunk novel, right? And that is terminal enshittification, right? That's when the platform turns into a pile of shit. So that is the procession of enshittification. That is what doctors would call the natural history of enshittification. But that doesn't tell you how enshittification works, nor why it's spreading, and without those details, we can't know what to do about it. So let's talk about the mechanism of enshittification. Why are tech companies so able to enshittify? Well, it's because they're digital. They run on computers. And computers are very flexible. And so any digital service you build on top of computers will have an enormous flexibility. After all, the only computer we know how to make is the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine, which is a lot of computer science jargon that means that every computer can run every valid program. And that means that platforms that are built on digital substrates can exploit the flexibility of digital to alter the logic of their business rules from moment to moment and for every user. They can twiddle the knobs on the back end to alter the payout for different parties in the system. Think of how Uber prices the labor of its drivers. Every Uber driver is offered a different rate for every ride, based on, and this is something that Veena Dubal, the scholar, calls algorithmic wage discrimination. For drivers who are more selective about which rides they're willing to take, Uber offers more per kilometer and more per minute. But if you take those offers and you become less selective about which rides you'll take, Uber lowers the rate that's offered per kilometer and per minute. It toggles up and down as the driver is more or less selective. It plays you like a fisherman with a fish on a rod, waiting for you to become inattentive and exhausted, to start accepting a lower baseline wage, to take more Uber rides, which means that you do less of whatever else it was you were doing in order to pay your bills, which means you become more dependent on Uber, and then your wage monotonically ratchets down to a sub-living wage. Now, this kind of shenanigans is not something that Uber thought of. I think we can assume that every boss, since the 19th century coal bosses that we immortalize in songs and Victorian novels, since they were around, they would have loved to have done this. The problem wasn't that they couldn't imagine it. The problem was that you could not build a warehouse big enough and fill it with enough people with green eye shades to change the paychecks of every coal miner from moment to moment and second to second to pull it off. The difference between a digital boss and an analog boss is not that they're more wicked or more smart or more imaginative. It's that they have a computer and so that they can do things that are faster. If you've ever seen the shell game done, where the magician hides a pea under 3 shells, the faster it goes, the harder it is to find the pea. The shell game is not a sophisticated trick. It's just a fast trick. And in every shell game, the quickness of the hand deceives the eye. And computers give bosses very fast hands. So think of those publishers that Facebook was trying to entice into becoming commodity suppliers to Facebook. It too would toggle up or down the reach of a post that a publisher made to Facebook based on how selective that publisher was being. If a publisher withdrew from Facebook because Facebook was demanding too much of it, Facebook's algorithm could reach into the archive of the post that publisher had made and show it to tens of millions of people. And then the publisher says, well, I thought Facebook wasn't a good home for our content, but clearly it's doing very well. I'll go back to it. The flexibility of digital, the proliferation of knobs and levers on the back end that these platform owners can move whenever they feel like it, that is the underlying mechanism of enshittification. This acts as a series of pumps that very quickly can move value from end users to business customers, from business customers to end users, from both to shareholders. That is how the enshittification disease works. All right, what about the epidemiology? Why is everything enshittifying right now? What led to the enshitocene? What is it about this moment that created the great enshittening? Was it the end of the zero interest rate policies of the world's central banks? Was it the change in leadership at the tech giants? Or is it that Mercury is in retrograde? I don't think it's any of those. I mean, take zero interest rate policy. The period of free government money for large firms definitely gave them a lot of surplus that they could play shell games with. But many of these companies, especially Facebook, started enshittifying long before the end of the zero interest rate policy. And it's also true that the tech leaders, the tech companies have new leaders. A lot of the original founders stepped down, and they were replaced with sort of bloodless bean counters who are interested in maximizing returns. But it is not true that enshittification correlates with the departure of the tech leader. For example, when Google had an AI panic, which they called a pivot, the Google boys went back to Google, and Google got worse. So I don't think we can blame it on the change in leadership. And I really don't think that it's that Mercury is in retrograde, and that's because I'm a Cancer, and as everyone knows, Cancers don't believe in astrology. When a whole bunch of independent entities all change in the same way all at once, that is a sign that the environment that they operate in has changed, and that is what happened to tech. All companies have conflicting imperatives. On the one hand, they want to make money. On the other hand, to make money, they have to spend money. They have to hire and motivate competent staff. They have to make products that people want to use or buy. The more value a company permits its staff, its suppliers, and its customers to carve off, the less value it has available to give to its shareholders. The equilibrium that we strive for, in which companies make products that we want to use under fair and decent conditions at prices that are also fair, that equilibrium arises from a situation in which companies fear that cheating, treating their workers badly, treating their suppliers badly, making bad products, charging too much, when they think that cheating will cost them more than they stand to make through their cheating. Now, what forces discipline companies? There's two that discipline all companies and two that discipline tech companies especially. The first one, obviously, is competition. Companies that fear that if they don't please you, you'll take your business elsewhere, on average, treat you better. And if they don't, they fail because you take your business elsewhere. The second one is regulation. Companies that fear that the government will punish them more than they stand to make from cheating you will, on balance, not cheat you. And if they do, the punishment will scoop up the gains that they seek to make. So those two forces discipline every company, but there's two forces that discipline tech companies especially. The first one is self-help that comes through interoperability, the ability of digital services to work with one another. Computers are extremely flexible, and so the digital products and services that we make from them are incredibly flexible. The only computer we know how to make is that Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine. It can run every program that is valid. And that means that users can always run a program that disenshittifies the product that the company has decided to enshittify. Imagine you're at a product meeting for a website, and you're around the boardroom table, and the person leading the meeting says, look, I figured it out. We're going to make the advertisements 20% more invasive and more obnoxious, and we're going to get 2% more revenue. out of those advertisements. Someone else at that table who does not care at all about the user's well-being will still put their hand up and say, look, the logic is sound, but what happens if 40% of our users go to the search engine and type, how do I block ads? Because when they do that, the revenue from those users, it doesn't stay at the status quo ante, 100%. It doesn't rise to the projected 102% that gets us all a bonus and a ski holiday in France. It falls to 0, and it stays at 0 forever, because no user ever went back to the search engine and typed, how do I start seeing ads again? So digital companies are always constrained by the fear that if they do something that displeases their users, that their users will unilaterally change the service back and make it better for themselves. So that's the first tech-specific constraint. And the second tech-specific constraint, the last constraint here, is tech workers. Tech workers have always had a very low union density, but that didn't mean that they weren't powerful. Historically, there was a talent shortage of tech workers, which meant that the workers had a lot of leverage over their bosses. Workers who disagreed with their bosses could just quit their jobs and go across the street and get a better job. And they knew it, and so did their bosses. Now, ironically, although this made sure that the tech workers got paid well, it also made them very exploitable. Tech workers overwhelmingly viewed themselves as founders in waiting, entrepreneurs only temporarily drawing a salary, heroic figures of the tech mission. And this is why things like Google's "Don't be evil" or Facebook's "Make the world more open and connected" mattered. They instilled a sense of mission in those workers. The librarian theorist Fobazi Ettar, she calls this vocational awe, but Elon Musk calls it being extremely hardcore. Tech workers had a lot of bargaining power, but they didn't flex it when their bosses demanded that they sacrifice their health, their families, their sleep to meet their bosses' arbitrary deadlines. So long as the bosses transformed their workplaces into whimsical campuses with gyms, gourmet cafeterias, laundry services, massages, and a free service to freeze your eggs so you could work through your fertile years, those workers could tell themselves that they were being pampered and not worked like government mules. But for bosses, there's an enormous downside to motivating your workers by appealing to their sense of mission, which is that your workers will feel a sense of mission. And when you ask them to enshittify the products that they ruined their health to ship, they will experience a sense of profound moral injury, and they will respond with outrage, and they will threaten to quit. And so tech workers became the final bulwark against enshittification. So the pre-enshittification era, the era of the old good internet, was not an era in which tech leaders were better. Those executives weren't nicer people. They were the same people with more constraint. Their worst impulses were checked by competition, by regulation, by self-help, and by their own powerful workers. So what happened? Well, one by one, each of these constraints was eroded until it dissolved, and it left the enshittificatory impulse of tech bosses unchecked. And that ushered in the age we're living in now, the Enshitocene. So it all started with competition. From the Gilded Age until the Reagan years, competition law's purpose was widely understood to be promoting competition. US antitrust law treated corporate power as dangerous in itself and sought to blunt it. And after the war, US technocrats came to Europe as part of the Marshall Plan and transposed American competition principles into European law as well. But starting in the neoliberal era, the era of Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, Brian Mulroney, and Ronald Reagan, competition authorities all over the world adopted a new doctrine that they called consumer welfare. Consumer welfare is the belief that monopolies are usually evidence of quality. That if you look around your city and you find that everyone shops at the same store and they buy the same products, that doesn't mean that that company is cheating. It means they're better than everyone else. And the last thing the government should do is step in to take the best store with the best products and punish it. So the world's governments stopped enforcing competition law. Enforcers ignored antitrust violations, and companies flouted antitrust law. So how did they do that? Well, one thing they did was merge with their major competitors. They absorbed smaller companies before they could grow to become major competitors. They engaged in an orgy of consolidation that produced the most inbred industries imaginable, whole sectors grown with the corporate equivalent of a Habsburg jaw. From eyeglasses to sea freight, from glass bottles to payment processing, from vitamin C to beer, most of the global economy in every sector is dominated by 5 or fewer companies. Now, some smaller companies didn't want to sell to the cartels, but the giants had free rein to flout competition law there as well, with things like predatory pricing, which is when you use the capital markets to sell goods below cost so that the new market entrant goes bankrupt. So here's an example. Before Amazon became the everything store, when it was just selling books, they went on an acquisition spree and bought other e-commerce companies that had come to dominate other verticals. And then they got to a company called diapers.com, which sold nappies. And they offered diapers.com a lot of money to become a division of Amazon. And they said, no, we want to be a standalone business. So Amazon tapped into the capital markets. They took $100 million and they set it on fire. They sold diapers below cost month after month until diapers.com went out of business. Then Amazon bought them for pennies on the dollar and shut them down. Competition has become a distant memory. The New Zealand software developer Tom Eastman says that the web has become 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And so these companies don't have to fear losing our business. The American comedian Lily Tomlin used to do these joke ads for AT&T, the American phone company, on Saturday Night Live. And she would play a telephone operator. And at the end of each of these adverts, she would turn to the camera and she would say, "We don't care. We don't have to. We're the phone company." Today's giants do not face the constraint of competition. They don't care. They don't have to. They're Google, and they bought 90% of the search market. That is the first constraint gone. And when competition goes, the second constraint, regulation, is doomed. Because an industry that consists of hundreds of small and medium-sized companies is a mob. It's a rabble. Hundreds of companies cannot agree on what to tell the European Commission or their national governments. They can't even agree on where to hold an annual meeting to discuss what they're going to tell governments and regulators. But when a sector dwindles to a bare handful of companies, 3 or 4 or 5 companies, it's not a mob anymore, it's a cartel. 5 companies or 4 or 3 or 2 or just 1, they find it easy to converge on just one message. And without wasteful competition getting rid of their profits, they have a lot of cash to spread around. Think about Facebook. Facebook hired the former Deputy UK Prime Minister Nick Clegg, and they pay him $4 million a year to sleaze around Europe, telling his former colleagues in government that Facebook is the only thing that stands between European cyberspace and the Chinese Communist Party. That's what money gets you. Tech's regulatory capture allows it to ignore the rules that constrain less concentrated sectors. They can pretend that when they violate our labor, consumer, and privacy laws, that it's fine because they did it with an app. That's why competition matters. Not just because competition makes companies work harder to keep your business and make their products better, not just because competition keeps companies from being too big to fail, but also because it keeps them from becoming too big to jail. There's plenty of things that we don't want to make better through competition, like commercial surveillance. It would be perverse to use competition to pit companies against one another to see which one can violate our privacy most efficiently. We don't want companies to be better at violating our human rights. When companies harm us, we don't want them to improve their capacity to harm us. We want to have our regulators step in and extinguish the harmful conduct. But the more concentrated a sector is, the harder it is for regulators to hold it to account. Instead, the companies that dominate the sector dominate their regulators as well, and the regulators ignore the harms that they visit upon us. So think about privacy. Google and Facebook act as though they're immune to privacy law because they violate our privacy with an app. Just like Uber says it's immune to labor law because it cheats its drivers with an app. And Amazon. Amazon violates consumer protection laws, but say it doesn't matter because they do it with an app. Amazon has a $38 billion advertising business. And I use the sarcastic inverted commas here because it's not an advertising business the way we think of advertising. What Amazon is selling for $38 billion a year is the right to priority in your search results, which means that when you search Amazon, the top results aren't the best match for your query. They're the products that paid the most to match your query, which is why on an average Amazon search, the first item is 29% more expensive than the best match for your query. The first 4 items on average are 25% more expensive than the best match for your query. On average, to get the best price, you have to go 17 places down to get the best match on Amazon. Now, if you walked into Carrefour and you said, give me your cheapest Duracell batteries, and they gave you batteries that weren't Duracell and cost 30% more than Duracell batteries, your regulator would step in and shut down the store for cheating you. But when Amazon makes $38 billion a year doing it, they say it's not cheating because we did it with an app. Now, this is where that first tech-oriented constraint, like self-help, interoperability, this is where it would really come in handy. You know, if you don't want your privacy violated, you don't have to wait for the regulator to pass a privacy law. You can install an ad blocker. And in fact, more than half of all web users in the world have installed an ad blocker. It is the most successful, largest consumer boycott in the history of the human race. But the web is an open platform. It is a remnant of an age in which tech consisted of hundreds of companies at each other's throats, an age where they were unable to capture their regulators. Today, the web is being devoured by apps. And apps are designed for enshittification. Because regulatory capture is not just the ability to ignore the rules, it's the ability to co-opt the rules, to have governments step in to crush your competitors and to control your users. Today's tech giants, they got big by exploiting self-help measures. When Facebook was telling MySpace users that they should leave Rupert Murdoch's empire and come to Facebook because they had a better privacy policy, that's not where the pitch ended. You know, what's the point of going to Facebook if your friends aren't there? How many times are you going to read the privacy policy and think about how great it is compared to MySpace's if your friends aren't there? So what Facebook did is it gave all of those users, those refugees from MySpace, a bot. And if you put your MySpace username and password into the bot would go to MySpace several times a day. It would scrape all the messages waiting for you in your MySpace inbox. It would paste them into your Facebook inbox. And you could reply to them there and it would push them back out to MySpace. So you didn't have to choose between Facebook and your friends. You could have both. But every pirate wants to be an admiral. When Facebook, Apple, and Google were doing this adversarial interoperability, this self-help to the companies that came before them, that was progress. If you do it to them, that is piracy. If you try to make an alternative client for Facebook, they'll say you violated American laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and European laws like the Copyright Directive. If you try to make an Android program that can run iPhone apps and play back the data that you buy in Apple's media stores, they will bomb you until the rubble bounces. Try to scrape all of Google, and they'll nuke you until you glow. The regulatory capture of tech is mind-boggling. Think of that law that I mentioned earlier, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, signed in 1998 and then imported to the European Union in 2001. It is a blanket prohibition on removing any kind of encryption that restricts access to a copyrighted work. So things like jailbreaking a phone, jailbreaking a games console, jailbreaking your printer so it can run third-party ink. And it has very stiff penalties. In the United States, the penalty is a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine for a first offense. That law has been so broadened since it was passed in the late 90s that now it can be used, a copyright law can be used to punish creators, rights holders, who give their own audiences access to the works that they paid for when it interferes with the business model of large companies. So here's an example of how that works. In 2008, Amazon bought a company called Audible. Audible was then the leading audiobook company. It is now an audiobook monopolist, 90% market share. It was an anti-competitive acquisition that should have been prohibited but wasn't because we weren't enforcing antitrust laws. Audible, with its 90% market share, has a blanket policy. Anyone who sells an audiobook on Audible is required to lock that audiobook with encryption so that it only plays in an Audible app. Now, as a supplier to Audible, that means that if I decide to leave Amazon and go somewhere else and take my audience with me, I can't give that audience a tool to unlock their audiobooks from Amazon's platform and take them to a rival company, which means that I have to make my audience choose between me and their libraries. And that's true even if I record the book, I pay the engineer for the book, I write the book. Amazon gets to step in and stop that from happening. So if I make that tool and I give it to you so you can follow me to a rival platform, I'm committing a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine for a first offense. So let's talk about how stiff that penalty is, right? If you were to just download an illegal torrent of my audiobook, you would pay a lesser penalty than I would as the rights holder for letting you take the book you bought with you when you leave Amazon. If you were to go to a truck stop and find my audiobook on CD and shoplift the CD, you would pay a smaller penalty than I would as the author and creator of that book if I gave you the ability to take it off of Amazon's platform. If you were to find the truck that delivers the CDs to the truck stop and point a gun at the driver and steal the truck, you'd still probably pay a smaller penalty than I would pay for giving you the tools to take the audiobook that I created off of Amazon's platforms. So think back to that product meeting where we're talking about advertising in our website. We've decided we're not going to make the website ads 20% more obnoxious because 40% of our users might figure out how to do ad blocking. So the person who's running the meeting says, all right, next order of business, how about our app? If we make the ads 20% more obnoxious, we can make 2% more from our app. And he looks expectantly at the person who objected before. And that person doesn't object. He says, the only thing I think that's wrong with that plan is we should make them 100% more obnoxious. Because if the user goes to the search engine and types, how do I block ads on this app? The answer that they'll get is you can't. So why don't we do it? So that's the reason that every company wants you to stop using their websites and start using their apps. There's no reason that gig workers who are facing algorithmic wage discrimination can't all install a counter app that monitors the wage being offered by the platform from moment to moment and automatically refuses jobs until the wage crawls up to a higher rate as an easy form of collective action, except the toolsmith who built that would face liability under copyright, cybersecurity, trademark, anti-circumvention, contract, trade secrecy, non-disclosure, and non-compete rules. These are these rules that we call them IP law. Now, in tech circles, IP is sometimes a controversial term. People say that it doesn't have a precise meaning. But in business circles, IP law has a very precise meaning. IP law means any law that allows the business to reach beyond the four corners of its offices and into the lives of its competitors, its critics, and its customers, and tell them how they must relate to its products. And an app is just a synonym for any web page that you wrap with enough IP to make it a felony to add an ad blocker to it. They don't care. They don't have to. They're the mobile phone duopoly. So what happened to that fourth constraint? What happened to the powerful tech workers who stood between their bosses and enshittification? Well, for decades, their high degrees of bargaining power and their vocational law did put a ceiling on enshittification, even after the tech sector shrank to just a handful of giants, even after tech companies captured their regulators so that they could violate our consumer rights, our privacy rights, our labor rights, and say it was okay because they did it with an app. Even after they created this felony contempt of business model where using IP could stop people from modifying or protecting themselves from their products, those companies were still constrained by their workers and the sense of moral injury that those workers felt in the face of their boss's imperative to enshittify things. Workers were, for many years, our last line of defense against enshittification. But that's over now. Last year, we saw 260,000 tech layoffs. Google fired 12,000 workers just 8 months after they did an $80 billion stock buyback that would have paid those workers wages for the next 27 years. Workers are no longer a check on their boss's worst impulses. Today, the response to, sorry boss, I refuse to make this product worse, is fine, you're fired, don't forget to turn in your badge, they're expensive. In other words, we have the same executives who have the same impulses, using the same tactics to extract value from their platforms by making things worse for their end users and their business customers, but they are no longer constrained by competition, regulation, self-help, or their workforce. They do what they've done every day for their whole career. They come to the office in the morning, they go to the big lever on the wall marked "Enshittify," and they pull it as hard as they can. But without competition, regulation, self-help, and workers pushing back, the lever goes all the way to 100. And that's why we're living through the Merdocene. Okay, so this is a little depressing, I understand. But hear me out. We have identified the disease. We've traced its natural history. We've learned how to spot the symptoms. A company that's good to its users, then worse, then good to its business customers, then worse. We've learned where the mechanism lies, the ability of digital services to change where the value goes from moment to moment and on a user-by-user basis. We've traced its epidemiological riddle, the collapse of the constraints that once prevented enshittification from taking hold in most companies, and if a company did become enshittified, caused it to collapse instead of shambling on as a zombie that seems to last forever, long after we would prefer to have it replaced by a better company. And now that we understand the disease, we can get to work on a cure. There are 4 constraints that prevented enshittification: competition, regulation, self-help, and labor. To reverse enshittification and to guard against its reemergence, we have to restore and strengthen competition, regulation, self-help, and labor. And on competition, it's actually looking pretty good. In the European Union, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, and even in China, we are seeing more on competition being done in the last 2 or 3 years than in the last 40 years. Competition authorities have woken up. They're blocking mergers. They're unwinding mergers. They're taking action on predatory pricing and other sleazy tactics. After all, they don't need new laws to do this. They have the laws. The laws have been on the books since the Marshall Plan. But Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher put them into a coma. They just have to dust them off and use them again. Now, the enshittifiers are not taking this laying down. The business press can't stop talking about how stupid and old-fashioned all of this competition law stuff is. They call people like me hipster antitrust. And they really hate any regulator that does their job, like Marguerite Vestager or Terry Breton, or in the United States, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, Lena Khan. Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal has run 100 editorials about Lena Khan, complaining that she's not doing anything. I gotta tell you, Rupert Murdoch does not pay his editorial board to write 100 editorials about someone who's not doing anything. Competition has a long way to go, but all over the world, competition is seeing a massive resurgence. Yes, they put it in a coma in the 1980s, but it's woken up, and it's really pissed. So what about regulation? How do we get tech companies to stop doing that one weird trick of adding with an app to their law violations and escaping enforcement? Well, here in the European Union, we're actually starting to figure it out. This year, we got the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, and there are parts of them that I don't think were well considered, but on balance, these are good pro-competitive rules. But the most important thing about them is not what the rules say, but how the rules will be enforced. Because the DMA and the DSA bypass national European courts and move all enforcement to the federal court. That means that tech giants can't rely on friendly courts in tax havens like Ireland, because every tax haven inevitably becomes a crime haven. If a company is able to pretend to be Irish this week, then next week they could pretend that they were Luxembourgian, or that they were Dutch, or that they were Cypriot, or that they were Maltese. And so the Irish government needs to make sure that they don't do anything that makes those tech companies that they're so dependent on unhappy, which is why the Irish data commissioner, who's in charge of enforcing privacy law on all the tech companies in Europe, which pretend to be Irish, hardly gets out of bed. And when they do make a ruling, 5 years later, it's overturned by the federal court. So now, we're going to start our enforcement in the federal court, and we're going to bypass national courts that have been compromised by tech companies. Now, in the United States, we might actually finally get a privacy law. You have no idea how backwards American privacy law is. The last time the United States Congress created a new consumer privacy law was 1988. It's a law called the Video Privacy Protection Act, and it prohibits video rental stores from telling the newspapers which VHS cassettes you took home. Right? That is the last time America got a new privacy law, 1988. It's been a minute. And the thing is, there are a lot of people who are angry about things that have a nexus with the bad state of American privacy law. Say you're worried that Facebook made your grandpa into a QAnon, or that Instagram made your teenager anorexic, or that TikTok brainwashed millennials into quoting Osama bin Laden, or that the cops are rolling up the identities of Black Lives Matter protesters, or maybe the rioters who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, or that right-wing attorneys general in red states in America are following teenagers who cross state lines to procure an abortion, or that black people are being discriminated against for hiring and financial products, or maybe that someone is making an AI deepfake porn of you. All of those start with the fact that we don't have a privacy law. A federal privacy law that prohibited the non-consensual collection and processing of data would make most of those impossible and seriously curtail the rest, which means that the coalition for a privacy law is gigantic. And it is cohering in the United States, and we are seeing new bills and new regulatory action being introduced every week. And so I'm confident we're going to get something here. What about self-help? Well, here's an area where the EU is lagging. The Digital Markets Act has a mandate that requires companies like Facebook and Apple and Google to open up gateways so that a new company, a co-op, a startup, even a big rival or a nonprofit, can run their own service that connects to it. And that's great if the gateway does what you need it to do for your vision of a new service. But if it doesn't and you just want to reverse engineer it, the DMA has nothing for you. IP law still makes this an incredibly fraught business. But in the United States, we're finally seeing some action here in the form of state right to repair laws that just prohibit companies from invoking IP law to stop people who reverse engineer their products in order to fix them. Because as Stein's law says, anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. And it is offensive that we have laws that allow companies to tell us how we have to use their products after we buy them. HP has an entire building full of engineers whose only job is to think of new ways to torment you with your printer so that you spend $10,000 a gallon on ink to print out your shopping lists, your kids' homework assignments, and your boarding cards. And this is grossly offensive, and the only people who like it are the people who are trying to figure out how to do this with other kinds of services, like Medtronic, the largest medical technology company in the world. It pretends that it's Irish, so it's sort of a European company, and they're figuring out how to lock people with diabetes continuous glucose monitors to their insulin pumps so they can turn them into walking inkjet printers. Now, finally, there's labor. There is a massive surge in tech unions all over the world, but especially in the United States, because tech workers are realizing that they are not founders in waiting. The days of free massages, facial piercings, and getting to wear a black t-shirt to work every day that says something your boss doesn't understand, those days are coming to an end. In Seattle, Amazon's tech workers walked out with its warehouse workers because they're all workers. The only reason those tech workers aren't monitored by AI that times them when they go to the toilet and takes money out of their paycheck if they pee too often is because they have bargaining power, and that bargaining power is going away. The way things are going, Amazon programmers will be like Amazon's warehouse workers. They're going to keep a bottle next to where they work so they can pee in that. You know, for a guy who builds penis-shaped rockets, Jeff Bezos really hates our kidneys. So we are seeing bold, global, muscular action on competition, on regulation, and on labor, with self-help bringing up the rear. And it's not a moment too soon, because the bad news is that enshittification is coming for everything. If a device has a networked computer in it, then the people who work it can do the Darth Vader MBA trick. I've altered the deal, pray I don't alter it further. They change the rules from moment to moment, violate the law, and say it's okay, I did it with an app. From Mercedes, renting you the accelerator pedal in your car by the month, to Internet of Things dishwashers that want you to use special expensive dish soap, enshittification is metastasizing into every corner of our world. Software didn't eat the world. Software enshittifies the world. We've been paying attention to the wrong end of the digestive tract. But there's a bright side to this, which is that if everyone is threatened by enshittification, then everyone has a stake in disenshittification. Just as with privacy law, the potential anti-enshittification coalition is massive and unstoppable. Okay, so cynics among you might be saying, isn't this just capitalism under a different name? Will any of this make a difference? I don't think this is just another word for capitalism. Like, I'm not going to cape for capitalism here. I'm not a true believer in markets as the best way to allocate all of our resources. If there was ever any doubt that that was the case, then capitalism's total inability to cope with the mounting climate emergency, I think, has ended all doubt. But the capitalism of 20 years ago made for a wild and woolly internet, a place where people with disfavored views could find one another, offer mutual aid, and organize. Whereas today, capitalism has produced a global digital ghost mall filled with bot shit, cryptocurrency scams, and crap gadgets from companies whose names are all consonants. The internet is not more important than the climate emergency. It's not more important than gender justice, than racial justice, than inequality, and it's certainly not more important than genocide. But the internet is the terrain on which we will fight all of those fights. Without the free, fair, and open internet, we lose those fights before they are begun. We can reverse the enshittification of the internet. We can halt the creeping enshittification of every digital device. We can build a better, enshittification-resistant nervous system fit for a digital world. Martin Luther King said, "It's true, the law can't make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me." And I think that's important. And it's true, the law can't force the corporate sociopaths who run these companies to conceive of you as a human being entitled to dignity and fair treatment, rather than as an ambulatory wallet that acts as a food source for the immortal colony organism that we call the limited liability company. But it can make that executive treat you as though they believed you were entitled to dignity and fair treatment, even though they don't think you deserve it. And I think that's important. Thank you. Carlos, welcome down.
Grazie molte a Cory Doctorow.
Thank you very much, Cory Doctorow. As I mentioned before, we only have a few minutes for questions for our distinguished guests before we conclude this edition of Biennale. We have our staff here with microphones. Please be very short because it is getting quite late. So please raise your hands if you would like to ask any questions. Of course, you can ask questions in Italian as well because they will be translated if necessary. We have two questions. I have always been passionate about all these topics and these courses, and I would like to ask you a rather peculiar and special question. Do you think that the internet is the first AI or something similar? How do you consider the internet? Is it just a platform, or do you think it is something that is that has other functions as well, and that it can be seen as artificial intelligence, something that is sentient, something that has its own rules, something that has its own movements?
Okay. How do you consider the internet? Do you think it's a sort of overall something sentient, something of sort of an artificial intelligence, or looking at the internet overall?
I don't, maybe I missed something in the translation there. I don't think the internet is an artificial intelligence. I think the internet is a communications and coordination tool, but that doesn't mean it's not important. Coordination is the foundational task of our species, right? It is the thing that allows us to be superhuman, right? What one person can do is human. What two people can do is superhuman. But as soon as two people try to do something together, they have to pay a tax, and that tax is the meeting, the discussion, the agreement, right? And we form institutions and we create systems to lower the coordination costs so we can do things together, so we can find each other and so we can mobilize. Those institutions take many forms: universities, governments, the church, the mafia, the family, the restaurant, right? They're all institutions that allow people to coordinate. Imagine trying to serve dinner to strangers every night without the structure of a restaurant, right? So coordination lowers, or automation services can lower our coordination cost, and they let us do more with less hierarchy. So it used to be that it took a giant building to coordinate, with a giant company in it to coordinate an encyclopedia or to coordinate an operating system. Now we make it more like ants build hills, right? With each person contributing some of their labor without having to make reference to an overall strategy or structure. And so that's a really powerful tool. Given the coordination problems we have in our future, we need really good coordination tools. So think about the climate emergency and an energy transition. We're very worried about how much energy we consume. And it's true that given our current energy configuration, we consume too much. But I'm a Canadian, and Canadians consume more energy than anyone in the world. We're like cold Americans. And if you wanted to give every person on the planet the energy budget of a Canadian, you would only need to capture 0.4% of the solar radiation that reaches the Earth's surface. But to coordinate that project, we are going to have to marshal the materials, the space, the storage, the transmission lines to do this. This is a big coordinated project that we are going to struggle to do using traditional coordination tools. So we need a good, open, fair internet so we can manage this project. After all, for most of human history, we treated materials as though they were abundant. We used them once and we threw them away. And we treated energy as though it was scarce. But every time the sun comes up, the Earth gets a new shipment of energy. We only get new materials if a meteor survives entry through the atmosphere. And so to reorient our society around abundant energy is within our grasp, but only if we can coordinate. And so that's why I think the internet is important. Not because it's an AI or a thing or a person or intelligent, but because it allows us to do more together.
Benissimo, una domanda qui.
Thank you.
Buonasera.
Just a second, date pure il microfono. Ok, perfetto, grazie.
Can you hear me now? Good. So good evening. I hope you can all hear me. How do you think... It's fine. Yep. Good evening again. So how do you think that tech workers should act in order to contribute to this process? And in your perspective, what do you think their situation is at this historical time in terms of negotiating and bargaining power as well?
Well, in the United States, bargaining power for workers has never been better, or not at least in living memory. I'm not the world's biggest Joe Biden fan. I became an American citizen just before the last election, and I donated money to 3 Democratic candidates for president. None of them were Joe Biden. But even I have to say that Joe Biden's administration has done a lot for labor rights. So in America, there's 2 main union avoidance strategies. The first one is that you illegally bust the union. So you fire union organizers, you spy on workers, and you lie to them. And the second one is if they manage to get a union, you don't give them a contract. You just refuse to sit down and bargain with them. So the new general counsel of the labor regulator, the National Labor Relations Board, Jennifer Abruzzo, an Italian, has said that any company that interferes with a union election, you don't have to have an election. The union is automatically recognized. And she said any company that doesn't give its workers a contract automatically has to abide by the contract of a comparable company that is unionized. And so we're seeing the end of the structural difficulties in forming unions. Now what we have to do is change the way tech workers think of themselves, not as small business people who are temporarily acting as employees, but as workers first. Now there is an enormous amount of tech worker organizing in the sector. And the most important thing about it is it's recognizing these correspondences with other kinds of workers in the supply chain. So you have tech workers who are expressing solidarity, for example, with Kenyan click workers who do data classification for AI training or for content moderation. And they're saying we are all tech workers in this company. We're all together. And that's the thing that's going to actually carry it forward, because it's only when we split up workers that they lose to their bosses, when we can play one off against the other one. So I'm more familiar with the American context than the European context here, but I'll tell you one more American thing at the risk of being an American chauvinist, which is that the large unions in America had become quite corrupt and ossified. And they've seen revolutions where they have new, good leadership for the first time in years. So the United Auto Workers just struck against all 3 auto companies, including Fiat, Stellantis. And they won a contract against all 3 with their new leadership. And when it was done, they announced, we set this contract to expire in 2028. Every other union, when you strike a contract, make your contract end in 2028 too. And when all of our contracts are due, we're going to have a general strike. So labor is cohering in a way that, I mean, I can't tell you how weird it feels to feel good, right? After all these years of feeling terrible, I wake up every day and I feel good about this. I live in Burbank, California, just steps from Disney, Universal, and Warner. I was out on that picket line every day I was home with the writers and the actors. They kicked ass. They did so well. They held the line. They're really figuring it out. It's great. And my union, I'm in the Animators Guild because I've written some cartoons for Netflix. My union, which sucks, we are now about to overthrow our leadership and replace them with good leaders who are going to demand a militant contract too. So it's a hell of a moment. Like, I know it's hard to feel good about things in 2024 when the world is on fire, but we should find those things that are like where we have a tailwind and just like run in that direction. Let's, like every tech workplace that organizes will have other tech workplaces rooting for it, helping it, or learning from its example. I can't tell you how great it feels and how disorienting it is to wake up feeling great about this stuff.
Abbiamo tutti bisogno di un po' di ottimismo. Ultima domanda.
We all need some optimism. Last question, because unfortunately we are running out of time. Anyone who would like to ask a question? There's one, I think in English.
Thank you for your insightful speech. You identified and proposed solutions based on what, yeah, it's me.
I can't say, oh, there you are. Hi. Sorry. Identified solutions based on, okay.
Based on what the government can do about the enshedification of any platform, or what the regulations can do, what competition laws can do. What can users do, or in other sense, maybe perhaps some engineers who believe in the same values of privacy or how to protect them.
Yeah.
How can they organize? Perhaps they can offer alternative solutions to this widespread, ubiquitous phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't think there's much we can do as users, per se, right? We like to think that in neoliberalism we can solve our problems by making better choices, right? If you don't like how Facebook treats you, just leave Facebook. The problem is that if you rely on Facebook because you have a rare disease and that's where the rest of your community is, or because that's where your customers are, or that's how you help your kid organize their football matches, then leaving Facebook is expensive. It costs you a lot and maybe makes you a less effective activist. What we need to do is make Facebook better and easier to leave, better and less important. And those are things we can't do as consumers, those are things we do as citizens. So technologists have built some really good alternative technologies to the platforms. There's good search tools, there's good social media platforms, there's Mastodon and the Fediverse and so on. The problem is that not that they're hard to use, but that they're hard to migrate to, right? So my grandmother was a Soviet refugee. She had been a child soldier during the siege of Leningrad, and after the war she took my infant father, and she and my grandfather went to Frankfurt and got a refugee boat to Canada. That's where I'm from. She's the only one in her family who left the Soviet Union. Everybody else stayed behind, even though every day there has been cause to regret that decision, right? Things just get worse for them there. Why did they stay behind? Well, it's because of what my grandmother had to give up. She didn't know if her family was alive or dead for 15 years. She left everything behind, not a single photo, nothing that she had in her family, in her home in Leningrad. She gave it all up, and so it was hard for her to leave, and most people didn't. Most people stayed. If we make it easy to leave, then people will try other things. But we can't make it easy to leave as individuals. We can only do that as citizens. This is a matter of regulation, right? As a technologist, it's not hard to build the scraper that lets you leave Facebook, but still have the scraper go back to Facebook and grab any messages waiting for you. But if you try to do it, they'll say that you violated cybersecurity, trademark, copyright, anti-circumvention, and so on, and they'll shut you down. And even if they don't, Apple and Google won't let that app be in the App Store. And so these are not things that we can solve as individuals, consumers, or users, or even as technologists building better platforms. All of those solutions that we have available to us as users, consumers, and technologists come after the regulatory environment that makes it possible for people to make those choices. Right now, the choice that you make as an individual doesn't matter because there is no competition, because there is no way to ease your passage from one place to another. Once that's possible, right, once you can leave Facebook without leaving behind everything that matters to you there, then by all means become that asshole vegan who shows up and tells all your friends you should stop being on Facebook. Leave Facebook. It's easy, right? I am a Zucker vegan. I haven't used a Facebook product since 2006, but I know that most people can't do that. When they can do that without having to give up everything that matters, I'm going to be the world's biggest pain in the ass, nagging Zucker vegan you've ever met. I'm going to be telling people, asking me to talk to you on WhatsApp is like asking me to talk to you in the smoking area at a restaurant. You're asking me to do something bad for my health, and it's not fair. But only once it's possible to leave. So we have to focus on solving the regulatory issues. And I know that for the last 15 years, saying we should focus on solving the regulatory issues was like saying we shouldn't do anything. Because when are the regulators going to listen to us? They're listening to us, right? The Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act go further than any European regulation in living memory, right? They're really attacking not just the behavior of the tech platforms, but their centrality and their importance. And all of the tech giants, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, they've all announced that they're not going to follow the law. They all delivered plans to the European Commission saying, we're just going to ignore the law. And the European Commission is saying, fine, well, the penalty for that is 10% of your global revenue. And then if you continue not to abide by this, it's 20% of your global revenue. And they're going to fight it, right? And the European Commission is going to need all of us to call our MEPs, to call our national governments, to stand up, to march, to join digital rights groups, to talk to our political parties about this. And the last thing I'll say is that this is a bipartisan feeling, right? This is not distinct to leftists or Marxists or progressives or socialists. The right, including the far right, are lined up against the tech monopolies, right? No matter what political tendency you come from, there is an institution that will help you work with other people as a citizen to do something about it. So I mentioned Lina Khan, this transformative chair of the Federal Trade Commission, the most powerful consumer regulator in the world. So 6 years ago, Lina Khan was a third-year law student. She wrote a paper called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox that totally upset the way that economists and lawyers thought about tech and competition. It was revolutionary. So during the start of the Biden administration, Joe Biden put her up for the Federal Trade Commission, and we didn't think she would get confirmed because the Republican senators would have to vote for her, the right-wing senators would have to vote for her. But 12 Republican senators voted for her, and the joke's on them because in 3 years she's done more than all of the chairs of the Federal Trade Commission for the last 40 years combined. So there are coalitions possible right now, even among people who you disagree with about everything else in the world, to fight corporate power and concentration. We are at the cusp of a new way of relating to technology, and it starts with having our elected representatives and the enforcers that they oversee actually enforcing existing law so that corporations are no longer too big to fail, no longer too big to jail, because a company that is too big to fail and too big to jail is too big to care. We have to make them care. We have to make them afraid that they'll lose our business, their employees, that they'll get fined. And without that, all is lost. And if we can do that, everything is possible. Thank you.
Grazie a Cory Doctorow. Ora, come di consueto, invito.
As usual, I kindly invite up here on stage for the final conclusion and ceremony of Biennale Tecnologia, Councillor Purchia, whom I can't see, she's probably gone. So the Pro Dean, Professor Barali, General Director Vincenzo Tedesco, Angelo Rotella, the Organizing Director. Thank you.
Sopravvissuti.
Sì. You've survived. Well, let me start, and I would like to begin by saying that you've already seen everything that was in these very few images. I mean, these fantastic extremely interesting 4 days. And so I would really like to thank with all my heart the curators Juan Carlos De Martin and Luca De Biase for the amazing work they did in designing the program. Congratulations. And also, I would just add one sentence because it's really late, and namely, I am happy that we've attracted all ages, young students, university students, very young kids, 0 to 14. It was always full of people with kids who wanted to experiment and try things and see what it means to use technology and think about technology. So thank you. Thank you also for thinking of everyone, all age brackets, and thank you for trying to reach everyone with what technology might be. That said, let me add one last thing. We'll see you in 2026 for the next edition. Well, I join in what you just said, saying Juan Carlo Martin and Luca De Biasi, and this final lecture with the very lively pace was very, very important in order to understand some facets, some aspects. And I have to say that Biennale is this, many thoughts, many ideas, many facets, many things. Everything's gone well. I was always afraid that I might get a phone call during these 4 days, but everything went really well. I just want to thank all my co-workers, every single one of them, for the work they've done. Amazing. And even now, they are working behind that wall. I thank them all. And most importantly, I would like to thank the team that we have here with a very strong spirit. We all work together, and this is the most important thing of all. And now, shall we go and have something to eat now? Thank you, Angela. Fantastic work. Well, thank you very much. Of course, I would like to thank again all our colleagues who've made all of this possible. Many of them are here in the room. We applaud them and thank them. I would like to thank the audience. Not many are left here, but we do all of this for you. You are our audience, and so on behalf of Councillor Purkia, who had to leave us for another commitment, thank you to the city as well, which participates with such interest. And thank you to all those who've come from all over Italy to join us in our event. Juan Carlos De Martin for one last word. We close the 4th edition of Biennale Tecnologia, and we need to remember where we started from. We started from the fact, 7 years ago, because it's already been 7 years. 7 years ago, I met a colleague I didn't know very well, but who's now here in the first row, Professor Guido Saracco from the Polytechnic, and he asked me to give him a hand in what he was doing at the time. And I remember I wrote 3 lines saying the Polytechnic might organize an event on technology and society. Just 3 lines. This was in his electoral program. He became the director of the Polytechnic. Sometimes electoral programs are not always very successful, but those 3 lines, he read them and he said, well, now let's turn this statement into something tangible. There were many other things in the strategic plan of the Polytechnic, and among the many things we did, there was also this idea of this festival. The institutions of the university, the Polytechnic as a whole, said, let's do it. And let's do it in 2019 on the 160th anniversary of the Polytechnic, a festival on technology and society, which I can tell you now, we didn't really know whether it would be interesting or successful among our students, and because, a festival on technology and society called Technology and Humanity did not exist in Italy nor in Europe. So we did hope, we had an intuition, we hoped it would work, but we were aware that we were taking a risk. In 2019, the Festival of Technology, this first event, was so successful that we then decided, together with the city of Turin, with Biennale Democrazia, and with the dean, we decided to turn it into a biennial event. It would be too much to do this every year, but a biennial, a Biennale Tecnologia. So we had an edition in 2020. With COVID, it was all online. Then we have a 2022 face-to-face, and then we have this edition this year, which I believe you can say is the edition that learned lessons from the previous one. Angela has joined us in the meantime with her experience, and the rest of the staff as well. And I think we've maybe managed to organize the richest edition. You can see it just from the program. But progressively, I think it's also the most refined, the best organized one, thanks also to the strategic consistency of Guido Saracco, our institutions, our colleagues, and everyone else. So let me thank all the institutions of Biennale Tecnologia, our guarantors, the scientific committee. They've all contributed to this edition. All the colleagues from the Polytechnic, all the professors, researchers, students, PhD students, everybody who's contributed to this edition. The audience, of course, all the people who've come, families with strollers, people with dogs. Maybe they've gone now. But so thank you all. Also, I would like to conclude with an email of a student of ours who wrote after the COVID edition, the online edition in 2020, called 16th of November, the day after, 11:03 in the morning. He wrote to the Dean of the Polytechnic, and he said, object, the best TV series of the Polytechnic. Dear Professor Saracco, good day. I followed almost obsessively the best TV series that the Polytechnic has ever created. The end of season 1 in 2019 was very moving. It left us all with a suspense, and so I had to continue with season 2. I put aside all my commitments for the weekend, and I was glued to the PC screen even 6 hours a day. It was worth it. The cast is exceptional. Old actors, high-level entertainment, despite the difficulty of the shooting. Of course, I'm talking about the Biennale Tecnologia. I am writing to thank you and the entire staff. These events give students food for thoughts and wood to feed their passion, hope, sometimes comfort, but especially awareness and push. I am an undergraduate. In a few months, I will leave the Polytechnic. It's a nice goodbye or farewell or a see you soon. I will anxiously await the 3rd edition. Kind regards, one among many. Thank you.